Department of Justice asked for more time.
I'll just repeat it. The federal law on marijuana remains in effect in every state. It's not eviscerated because a state ceases to enforce the law in that state. The Cole Memorandum set up some policies under President Obama's Department of Justice about how cases should be selected in those
started
states.
in 2014 is a much different world than we are today. Like
Right.
the Cole memo had just been a thing. And for folks that are, I'm not just saying my own name, Google the Cole memo and you'll.
The Cole memo. You should have a Cole memo.
Yeah, so we
Have
should.
that could be, if you ever have a newsletter, it should be the Cole memo.
I'm taking it. I love it.
Do that
I've been
now.
looking for something. There we go. Seriously, no, I'm going to credit you when I use that.
You don't even have to. Just steal it and say it was your idea.
Okay. So, but anyways, back then in 2014.
What people forget is that the fact that this is still federally illegal, and the only way that there are state legal state markets is by virtue of something called the Cole memo and the other items that came out, the other advice that came out is part of that.
And by the way, I know I do the Chillinois Podcast now, but that's the name of my new show, which maybe you recognize the reference.
Right. It's good.
Thanks, man. Thanks. So that'll be the new thing, kind of breaking out of the mold of Chillinois. I love Chillinois, but it kind of boxed me in
Right.
geographically, but also people just have this connotation since we've got the logo and everything that it's only about drugs.
Right.
We certainly talk about drugs a lot, but it's not only about drugs. So, cool. You ready to rock and roll,
Ready
my
to
friend?
rock, Cole. Let's go.
Thank you all for tuning in to the final episode of the Chillinois Podcast. Let's get right into it because I've caused more confusion than I intended surrounding this announcement. Looking back, I really should have been more forward about the fact that my future plans involve what most people would call a rebrand. Now, I didn't consider it to be a rebrand because, as I've mentioned on this show before, I just see myself as another person like you, except I happen to buy a microphone and you've just been kind enough to listen. If you've been following my podcast for a while, you'll remember I've referred to this show as the Chillinois Podcast. However, today we bid farewell to that name. And so the question becomes, what's next? Well, I am so excited to introduce you to my new project. Like I say, it'll basically be exactly what you've been accustomed to under a new name. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm excited to introduce you to the Cole Memo. I think that this name not only adds the appearance of professionalism that I really need, but it pays homage to my passion for cannabis. With that said, over time, I have become a bit frustrated with people pigeonholing my show as solely cannabis related. And it's true. I do spend a significant amount of time on this show discussing cannabis, but as hardcore listeners of my show know, it's not the only topic I've covered here. And I think this name change grants me the flexibility to explore a broader range of subjects and locations. In many ways, Chillinois boxed me in. And another reason I really love this name, and I know that some of you are going to consider this cheesy, but I love it because it incorporates my name into the show name. I also appreciate the fact that it's not an overt reference to cannabis policy, although for those in the know, my cannabis nerds out there, or for those of you that paid attention to the context I set in this video, you'll know that it is a reference to cannabis. But like I say, I don't feel that it's overt. I don't feel like for most people, the Cole Memo screams cannabis, and that's exactly what I find so appealing about it. In the past, when I'd invite guests onto the Chillinois podcast, especially if they were high profile, they'd see my name, my logo, they'd think, Chillinois? I'm not sure I would like to stake my reputation on this. So I believe the Cole Memo will go a long way towards making it easier for me to avoid any such explanations at all. My intentions are genuine, and I'm here to foster meaningful conversations for change. Lastly, I cherish this name, and I sort of alluded to this earlier, but I really like this name because it really signifies that I will be exploring a broader spectrum of topics. But with that said, I really want to emphasize that you will not notice any major changes to the show itself. I will continue to cover cannabis and drug policy news, particularly as it relates to Illinois, just as I always have. So, for those of you that were concerned that the end of the Chillinois podcast would mean the end of my coverage on cannabis and drug policy, rest assured, I'm here for the long haul. Or the long high, whatever we want to call it. And I've lined up an exciting roster of guests for the new show. I'll just name off a few for you. I'll name off two. Tommy Chong and Mike Fouché. And if you've been listening to the Chillinois podcast for any extended period of time, you'll know those two names. You'll know them well. Now, the cool news is you don't need to do anything to access the Cole Memo. It will be available on the same platforms and feeds where you've previously found the Chillinois podcast. I'll update the feeds to reflect the name change in due time. But in the meantime, please visit thecolememo.com and follow our social media pages to show your support for the project. If you go on social media, you can look up the Cole Memo or the Cole Memo podcast, and you'll probably find something. If you're listening to this episode upon release, you can go to thecolememo.com, and I'm about to display my screen. When you go to thecolememo.com, and again, this is if you're listening to this upon release, things may have changed if you're listening to this later. There's one post available, and it says coming soon. If you click on that, it'll take you to a page where you can sign up to be notified when the Cole Memo officially launches. But as I mentioned, if you already are subscribed or are receiving the Chillinois podcast through any feeds, you don't have to make any changes. Wherever you're listening to this episode right now, you will continue to receive the Cole Memo through these channels. So essentially, as I mentioned earlier, everything will proceed as usual, just under a new name. So I want to express my deep gratitude for your support that you've given me over the years. And I hope that you'll join me on this very exciting journey with
the Cole Memo,
the Cole Memorandum,
the Cole Memo,
the Cole Memo,
the Cole Memo,
the Cole Memo. The Cole Memo is what allows this whole thing to go on.
I mean, you have to respect the memo.
Hey, this is Tommy Chong, and you're listening and watching the Cole Memo.
Kind of in spirit now. It used to be the Cole Memo. Shout out to me. I'm just joking. I didn't write it.
I met Mr. Cole. He was quite an individual. I expected to see, this government lawyer type, and he came in, he had gravitas. I think he knew exactly what he was doing when he wrote the memo about giving states the ability to innovate underneath that framework. Because I think we all thought of Cole as repressing the development. And I got to say, I was really super impressed on what he produced at a time when the Department of Justice was not very open to these kind of ideas. He deserves a hell of a lot more credit for what he did with his framework to develop legalization of drugs. And he wasn't, pro-drug. He understood the illegal markets and the trafficking and the criminality and the money laundering aspect of it, and saw this as a better format, and that states would get it right eventually, given the opportunity. They would balance out those decisions, and the framework was there. I didn't think of him initially this way, but for me, he really is the father of national legalization. That memorandum was a framework. It was posed under a control, but it allowed development. It was a really amazing piece of work.
Once again, folks, you can go to thecolememo.com and sign up to be notified when the Cole Memo officially launches. But if you're listening to this episode of the Chillinois Podcast now, just know that you'll be able to listen to episodes of the Cole Memo right here from this same feed. So in other words, you don't have to do anything. Keep it locked right here. I hope you all join me on the Cole Memo. Take care, everybody.